Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. I really got to ask about this first, this French poster of this Bruce Lee film. What film? Which film would we know this as?
Actually, it's not a Bruce Lee film, even though his name's on the poster.
Really?
Yeah, the movie is The Return of the 18 Bronzemen.
That's why I didn't recognize the title. It's not even a Bruce Lee movie.
Right, yeah. After Bruce Lee died, so many kung fu movies really tried to capitalize on his fame. And so they would even act like kung fu, or like Bruce Lee was in the movie, you know, even though he was long dead at the time. So, yeah, that's why it's like in memory of Bruce Lee, even though it has nothing to do with him whatsoever.
I guess they're on solid legal ground just saying in memory, but how do you get a poster like this?
This day and age, I got it on eBay.
Oh, sure.
You know, everything's different now with finding the rare, you know, movie materials. But, yeah.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from the basement of the Hollywood Theater in Portland, Oregon, where we're not just seeing in memory of Bruce Lee posters. We're seeing a lot of films. We're seeing a lot of gear, a lot of theater seats. I'm speaking, by the way, with the programmer here at the Hollywood Theater, Dan Halsted, who's also the founder of the 35mm Shaolin Archive. He's the go-to man for kung fu films from the 60s through the 90s here in Portland, Oregon. And then they've become a chunk of the Portland zeitgeist these days. After he rescued many a print out of storage in Vancouver, we'll talk about that soon. He also programs the Portland International Film Festival After Dark series, founded the Portland Grindhouse Festival, and I think you get a good sense of his cinematic sensibility. But we're going to get farther into it. For those who don't know, Vancouver, the Shaolin Archive. How'd you find these prints? Why were they there?
I had bought some trailers. I also collect 35mm previews of classic kung fu films, and they're usually really hard to find. And I bought some from a guy in Vancouver, and they were in incredible condition. So right away I was asking questions about where he got them, and he also had a bunch of posters as well. And so I was wondering if, since everything was in such good condition, if there were complete prints as well.
And to give an idea, you can't just buy these things on eBay, these prints. Like, these are not easy to come by. These are film prints, heavy canisters of 5-6 reels of kung fu movie. And for some reason, they're not around anymore?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a 35mm print is about 50 pounds per movie. And most of these kung fu films are incredibly hard to find. When I first started programming, I really wanted to show a lot of classic kung fu films and was really shocked to find that there just weren't any available. The studios, for the most part, were gone or just didn't have prints anymore. Everything that had come to the U.S. just seemed to be gone. And even in the underground world of film collectors, where you can find a lot of rare films, there weren't kung fu films. And what bothered me even more than that was the fact that nobody seemed to care.
Right.
You know, whenever I'd ask them, they'd just roll their eyes. Yeah. So anyway, when I bought the trailers from the guy in Vancouver, I just started asking him if he had any complete prints as well, and he was acting a little shady about it, and he just stopped answering my emails. So I'm like, okay, he stole them out of somewhere, and he's not telling me where. So luckily, one of the trailers he sold me had a movie ticket inside, and it said Shaw Theater, like $2 or whatever. So I did some research and found out that the Shaw Brothers Studio in Hong Kong, which is it's like the MGM of Hong Kong in their heyday, had owned a chain of theaters in the U.S., including one in Vancouver that was their main theater on the West Coast.
The heavy Chinese population in Vancouver, exactly. I would guess, led to that.
Yep, exactly. So I did more research, and I found out that Run Run Shaw, who was the head of Shaw Brothers Studio, who's actually still alive, he's like 106 years old, he had sent his niece, Lucy Shaw, over to Canada to run their theater chain. So through the power of Google, I tracked her down, and I talked to her, and I told her, hey, I think there might be some films left behind in that theater. Do you know about this? And she didn't seem to care, but she put me in touch with Run Run Shaw's people, and they sent me a key, and they just said, go for it and see if there's anything there. So I drove up to Vancouver, my girlfriend, And the theater had been closed in 1985, been open 1971 to 85. And
then this was in sort of like a cracktown type area, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was on Hastings Street, which Vancouver, is a really great, nice city, but I actually saw a show on Discovery Channel that showed footage of this theater as well, and that 4-block area on Hastings Street has the highest concentrated use of heroin and crack in North America.
I guess I'm not that surprised. I mean, I've been there too.
Yeah. If you've been there and seen it, it's really horrible. Right. It's just like a sea of crackheads. It's awful.
But you'll brave that for Kung Fu Prince.
Yeah. Yes. So went inside the theater. It was in disrepair. The auditorium was in good shape. Looked around for a while, and then finally went down to the stage that was in front of the screen, tore a panel off the stage, and underneath was all the film. There's over 1,000 reels of film stashed in there. And the strange thing was it was actually ideal film storage conditions.
Coincidentally it was.
Yeah, just since Vancouver has low humidity and the fact that they were all stored together, they weren't in film cans, which is bad for the film. It's good for them to breathe. So
you see these canisters, non-canisters. You see these reels outside of canisters, and they're just there. And what strikes you first? Is it like, did you realize there's a wealth of Kung Fu movies probably, or is it like, well, this could just be junk?
My first thought was I was overwhelmed, for sure. And the fact that they were in total disarray. Since a 35 millimeter print is 5 or 6 reels, they were completely disorganized. So I didn't know if there was even going to be complete films in there. So we had to go through literally reel by reel and write down what it was. And we were in there a couple hours before I figured out, okay, we're actually going to be able to piece together films here. Right. So it wasn't excitement right away. It was more like, oh my God, I had to walk through that sea of crackheads, and I'm worried about my car parked out there, and there's all this film. This is ridiculous. And then, how are we going to get it out of here? It's like 8,000 pounds of film. What are we going to do? So that was more the thought process at the time.
When did you realize that you had like specific gems of the 60s to 90s Kung Fu era? What films did you realize you had there and you were like, oh, that's the tip of an iceberg. That's like, this is a serious thing.
The ones I got most excited about were, there was a print of 36 Chamber of Shaolin, which is a really classic Kung Fu film, 8-diagram Pole Fighter, which is my personal favorite, which that was the one that every reel I found, I was so excited that we were actually piecing it together. A lot, they were mostly really obscure movies. They're, for people who know Shaw Brothers movies and Kung Fu cinema would have been thrilled, but, Boxer's Omen and Two Champions of Shaolin and Shaolin Temple, tons of movies, but a lot of classic great stuff that, a lot of them are the only known prints in the world, and almost every single one is the only one in the Western Hemisphere. So
now, tell me just some background. Go back to, what was your introduction personally to Kung Fu cinema? When did it enter your life and how?
Yeah, that was growing up. I grew up in a really small town. And we didn't even have cable. So there were only, the local video store had just a couple of Kung Fu films that I saw, and I liked them. But it wasn't until, high school that I started having access to more, and then even then it was still like, have to find them in strange places, at Goodwills or, try to find like the oddball video store that would have more. And then it wasn't until I moved to Portland after high school that I really started, I could find, the Asian video stores where you could actually rent. Sometimes they wouldn't have subtitles, and then we have a great video store, Movie Madness, that at the time had a small collection, but I still saw a lot of classics from there. And then, once eBay came around, then you can really track down a lot of the bootlegs and so.
What did Portland look like from that 600 population town in Oregon you grew up in? Like, was Portland like the city on the hill? That's a cool city over there. Or the place you naturally want to go if you grow up in a small town in Oregon, or what?
Yeah, definitely. And it seemed massive. Coming from a town of 600 people, Portland seemed huge. Now that I've lived here for a long time, it seems like a very small city. But, just the chance to be around people who are more open-minded and some actual culture. Sure. I enjoyed the small town while I was there, but, at a certain point, you got to get out of there.
What was the kind of charge a 60s or 70s kung fu movie would give you as a kid that you couldn't get from other films?
You know, I get asked that a lot, and it's tough. It's like there's more than just like the fighting. I think people who maybe don't watch the films don't understand that, because it is Chinese culture. You know, like I always compare the kung fu film to the American Western. It's the same thing. You know what I mean? Like the gunslinger wandering the Old West is the same thing as the Shaolin monk wandering ancient China. You know? So I think just seeing that culture, and you hear a lot of their stories. You know, like we always praise the outlaws. We have Jesse James and whatever that, you know, we made movies about. But, you know, watching movies about the Shaolin Temple and about like all these heroes, you know, that the stories have been carried around for generations, it's really interesting. So I think a lot of that grabbed me. And just a lot of the over-the-top, you know, I love exploitation movies anyway, also as well. So just, I don't know, there's a lot of different things that appeal to me, I think, from it.
Would you consider yourself to be kind of an equivalent, but going in another direction of, say, well, you know, those European cinephiles you meet who are all about the American West and gunslingers? You know what I mean? Like they come from their culture. They're like that version of old America is so cool. Are you like the American who looks into that vision of old China is so cool? Even if the Chinese maybe don't. I don't know. Do the Chinese like these anymore?
You know. Yeah, there's a lot there. First, I think the first part of what you said is a good comparison. Yeah, I think that's probably totally true. I bet, yeah, to the Europeans, seeing that the Western, I mean, it's really interesting once the Italians started making Westerns, what they thought of the Old West, I think is really interesting. When these movies were made, they were taken seriously. You know what I mean? In China. I mean, they had fun with them, but it was serious cinema. Like, it always really bothers me when people don't consider these movies as important as, you know, Ingmar Bergman or Godard or whatever. They're just as important. You know, Chang Cheh is just as important of a director as Godard, I think. So, yeah, I can't remember where I was going with that, but yeah.
Did today in China, are these still respected?
Today, you know, I've never been to China or Hong Kong, but from what I hear from other film programmers there and other people that live there, they say that the younger people don't care about the older films. You know, I think to the older population, they're still important, and they seem to be well regarded. Like there is the Hong Kong Film Archive, and there are film festivals there that will play some older films. But I think for the most part, younger generation, especially in Hong Kong, they really only care about what is popular right now. You know?
Often something Western.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I don't think they're concerned about it, which is too bad. That seems to be the case.
Now, anybody who really is into a subgenre, they always have to face and this goes for anything, film, music, books, what have you. They always have to face that question, that accusation of an outsider saying, those are all the same, right? So what do you tell somebody to explain that it's not all the same? You know, it's the same as if you were a reggae fan, I guess, and someone that sounds all the same. Why aren't these all the same for someone who hasn't watched as many as you have? You
know, that is so hard. I think I can't even just tell people that. It's more like, just come. Just come to, you know, I'll give people free passes and be like, just come. And I think once they do experience it, especially with Shaw Brothers films, is they'll see the movie and, oh, it has a real production value. Like, I think they think of it all as like the lower budget films that people have seen. I've gotten plenty of friends into it because that's all they saw as kids, were like poorly dubbed movies, you know, that were like the bargain basement kung fu films, and then they see, oh, this film with a real production value and great sets and actors and costumes, you know, and it's like a real production.
It's not like hokey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or if it is, it's fun. I mean, sometimes, sure, that happens, but.
And this is something someone can go to. I mean, you say come and see them, and you do these screenings at least once a month, as I understand it, here at the Hollywood Theater. And how much of a scene for kung fu cinema has developed here? You know, was there much before you discovered the films in Vancouver and made the archive, or how has that worked? Is it all post discovery the scene has developed?
Well, it definitely post me programming them. Like there were no kung fu films playing at all in town, just because there weren't any. But you know, it's built up, and now, I mean, it's insane. I do monthly, call it Kung Fu Theater, and do once a month, and I'm always blown away. You know, it's to the point now where it's averaging close to 300 people on a Tuesday night, it's insane, and the crowd loves it. People really get into it. I always introduce the movies, and talk about the movies for a little bit. The audience just really responds. It's a lot of fun. It's like great energy in the crowd.
Right. What is the place of Kung Fu cinema now in Portland film-going culture? Because there is a film-going culture. It sounds like this is becoming more and more part of it. But what about Portland audiences is receptive to seeing a Shaw Brothers movie projected on film, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, Portland has a really open-minded film audience. I'm really lucky to be here. I mean, we're definitely a huge movie-watching town, probably because it rains so much. Sure. We have tons of independent theaters. We have more independent theaters, I think, any other city in the country, even New York and LA. So I'm lucky that, people do respond. And I do think other theaters in town do a good job, but I do think that the programming tends to stay in that area of just what has been considered great cinema, or the movies you should see. And I really try to move outside of that. So I am lucky that it's also like, I guess it's maybe a little bit of a trendy thing to, find these movies from the past. People love Quentin Tarantino's influence, of like these lesser known exploitation movies. People just really respond to that here. I've traveled to other cities and shown films, and for the most part it's gone really well, but it's never the same turnout that they get here.
Do you consider Quentin Tarantino's taste in exploitation films to be a solid taste in exploitation films, considering that you yourself are an enthusiast? I mean, is he a leading light of the exploitation revival movement, or is he just kind of doing his own thing?
I think he is a bit of a leading light. I mean, it's really interesting to have somebody that high profile be into these movies, and the fact that he champions so many of them. I mean, he has saved some films himself, and he's a film collector. He has a huge collection of films. I borrowed films from him, but he also just, him talking about certain films in interviews. There's films that have come out on DVD because he talks about it in an interview and people are interested. So, I think he's had a huge impact on a lot of movies that maybe would be lost at this point. So I think that's great.
You've mentioned taking Kung Fu theater on the road, and you've, off mic, said before that you took it to the New Beverly in Los Angeles, in my town, the theater that Tarantino owns, and has promised to keep running and showing film as long as he has any money at all, from what I understand. So that's certainly a coincidence of venue and material, very much. But what cities react particularly well to Kung Fu cinema?
I was in San Francisco in July at the Roxy Theater. And that was really exciting because here in Portland, we have a very small Chinese community. And I always wish that more Chinese people would come, but it's almost all white people. But being in San Francisco, there are quite a few Chinese people came, an older Chinese audience. And they were so excited after the movie. They really wanted to talk to me and they were so thankful. That was really cool to me. I really liked that. And they brought their kids, there were some people who brought their grandkids. That was amazing. So I really like that. Most cities have been great. The only city that it was a huge disappointment was St. Louis. There was almost no turnout. Yeah, and it was kind of a strange venue.
Might have been a promotional issue or a sensibility issue?
I think it might have been kind of a mix. I'm not really sure.
What do you look for? I mean, what jumps out at you when you're watching, when you find, I don't know if there are many more 60s or 70s Kung Fu films you haven't seen, but when you come across one, what are you looking for that separates the gems from the run-of-the-mill?
I mean, a lot of it I think is the same as what you'd find in other cinema, if it's the production value or, versus if it was people with talent making the movie, or was it people just trying to cash in, which there was so much of that in the 70s in every genre, all over the world. So I think that's probably like the main factor. But there's plenty of films I still want to find that aren't available, and there's so many I haven't seen. Like once you go down the rabbit hole of exploitation and Asian cinema of like 60s through the 80s, it's unbelievable how many movies there are. It's incredible.
Will this eventually require from you a visit to China or Hong Kong to just get to the source?
Yeah, well, I need to go anyway. And I will definitely, when I'm there, try to do some research and find some films. Although I'd be hesitant to be too excited since they may not have subtitles.
Sure.
So
you could probably still enjoy it, though. I would
definitely,
guess.
Sure.
You've watched many an unsubtitled film in your time, I would imagine.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely have on video. Yeah.
You mentioned these films as a window into Chinese culture. I mean, have they been a vector for you to learn more about other forms of Chinese culture, or are they more of a how to put it, more of a locus of Chinese culture you can just sort of experience? You can experience specifically Kung Fu cinema, and from that becomes your window into it. Do you get the distinction? I mean, whether it's a pathway to other parts of the culture or whether it is like a concentrated version of the culture that you experience? I
think it's a pathway to other aspects of the culture. Maybe not so much myself, but I've definitely seen that in other people. And I see other, just because of the press I've gotten, I meet, people who are, write graphic novels, or they're artists, or, other film programmers who have been so influenced by these movies, and then they're into completely other aspects of the culture, whether it's art or whatever. So I think that's totally. I think it's sometimes it is like it opens the door to an interest for people.
Now, I want to know, with the issue of sort of providing a gateway drug to Kung Fu cinema, what films do you suggest to people when they want to get into it, and what provides them the best way in? I don't know if it's the easiest way, and you want to give them, maybe you want to give them the most intense way in, but what do you want to show to someone like that, the neophyte?
Usually, if they're local, I usually just try to get them to come see it on screen,
right?
Because that experience is so different. The communal experience in the theater is so amazing. Especially with Kung Fu films. It works so well. But the film I usually try to show people is 36 Chamber of Shaolin. Because it's the serious film. Most people would probably say it's the best Kung Fu film of all time, probably. But it is like higher production value. It's a really serious movie. And it can stand alongside, Seven Samurai and all the great films of world cinema.
From what era is it?
It's mid-70s, 77, I think, 78.
When does the high watermark come for Kung Fu cinema? Is it mid-70s like that, or is there one era that defines the sort of whole movement?
It's, after Bruce Lee got popular, early 70s, that's when they just started cranking out movies in Hong Kong. Shaw Brothers was make multiple movies at a time. They'd be putting out, 30 movies a year, Kung Fu films every year. They made all types of films. And then there were the non-studio movies. So it's it started in 1970 and then went until mid-80s, where there are so many movies made, And then there are different eras kind of in there. Jackie Chan got popular in the late 80s, so then the movies become more jokey as people are trying to do what Jackie Chan's doing. And then Golden Harvest, the other studio, comes around in the early 80s, and they kind of changed it from the ancient Chinese setting and moved it up to modern films, modern Kung Fu films. So, but that's kind of the high point. And then it changed mid to late 80s. Then the Hong Kong films kind of changed to the John Woo gunplay films instead of the Kung Fu films.
And none, I would assume, have been exciting as the mid-70s ancient Chinese set. Pure. You might say pure?
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
And I think of, I don't know if you've seen this film, but there's a film by Ming Liang Tsai, who's a director these days from Taiwan. It's like part Malaysian, part Taiwanese. He has a film called Goodbye Dragon Inn, which is entirely set in the final days of a theater showing the original 62, I think, film Dragon Inn. And it's a decrepit theater. There's very few people left, and the whole film there's almost no dialogue. It just sort of moves through this theater where this film is screening. I mean, is there a sense of... There's a sense, I get the sense that it's sort of more robust than that in America, like the communal quality of watching these films. What kind of charge does that give it?
The communal experience? Yeah. It gives it a lot. I think this day and age, with film going away, theaters are going to digital, everybody can just watch everything at home. Everybody has Netflix and on demand and everything else. And it's almost like that communal experience is being forgotten. And if you go to a megaplex, they show a movie, 100 times a week. So there might only be a couple people in the theater when you go watch it, even though it's a hugely popular film. So I think it's become so unique now of coming to see something on celluloid, which is a different experience. In the Hollywood here, we have a huge screen. It's like a 50-foot screen. And with all those people and the energy that you get, experience that with a crowd is really unique now. It's interesting. And I found as film programmer, I've been showing a lot of more classic films. I just showed Rosemary's Baby last week, and made a big deal about it. A 35 millimeter print. There's even a newer print, looked great. And the response was huge. Great turnout all week long for the film, and I'm noticing that people are responding to 35 millimeter. That's already become a unique thing for people. I think that's interesting.
Is there a vintage, because of the vintage equality, or because we're still in maybe the end of it, but the era when it still has a crisper look than most digital projection anybody's seen?
Yeah, I think kind of both, yeah. But I mean, it definitely looks better. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
So, and I just think there are enough people that are interested in that, and it's still more of an experience. I think digital is still like, I can watch it at home. What's the difference?
Right. And I wonder. I mean, I think of there's a quote that Anthony Lane in the New Yorker wrote in a review of Tower Heist of all films, but he said that there's only one problem with home cinema: it doesn't exist. As soon as you can hit pause or get up, you're not really having an experience. You're not having the cinematic experience. You're just kind of sort of like pulling something up. And for all the convenience of being able to pull something up, it does seem like that. The more people do that, the more they realize that it's a different thing to go to the theater. I don't think, maybe in like 1995, I don't think people really, I'll watch it at home maybe, or I'll go to the Megaplex. Neither option was particularly appealing when your choices were VHS or the 16-screen theater down the road. You know what I mean? Now, they've branched apart, and you're getting two very distinct things. Does that make sense to you?
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, this day and age, it's not even, I'll pause the movie and go do something. Like, look at the younger generation. Sure. They're on their phones and iPads and whatever the entire time. You know what I mean? They don't sit and watch a movie. You know what I mean? You're doing three different things at once.
Right.
So I think that experience of, you're stopping everything else while you watch this is really unique now. And I do think it is a little depressing I think younger people, they don't even think of movies that way. We just played this movie Side by Side. There was a documentary about film going away and digital taking over. And Martin Scorsese talked about that in the movie. He said, to people who are 20 and younger, they don't see a movie as an experience and something the way that we all grew up with, where you were actually in the movie, right. You were experiencing that while you're watching it. I don't think younger people even think about that. It's just something that's kind of there in the background.
Right. It's another vector of noise going on. On planes, I'm often on planes. I do see, kids with an iPad open and then their phone, playing a game on the phone, and then they're also listening to something else on their headphones.
Three things at once. Yeah.
I say kids. I'm close to 30. I'm not 30 yet. I feel like I should be the younger generation, but it seems so different to look back. I mean,
you're just past it. Yeah, it's younger, a little bit younger than you. Yeah, seems to be.
Is it really? You've seen that stark divide between the 30-ish and then the under 30-ish?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it seems to be early 20s and less. I think when they've had phones for so much of their lives.
Right. Yes, we both got phones at some point. Phones happened during our lifetime. Yeah. The internet happened during our lifetime. They weren't already there. But you probably get very young people at the kung fu screenings, and they probably, I don't know if they see the light per se, but they're not on their iPads while any of these films are playing, right? They're watching.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I always make a big deal to make sure people don't use their phones or talk. Right. I mean, responding to the movie is, of course, that's wonderful, but I always make a big, because I also do with the Grindhouse screenings, and with older horror films, that's always like a fight. Make sure people aren't going to be talking, because the people who show up and think that they're there to like heckle the movie or whatever. Okay. But I know, awful. But yeah, younger people, I mean, some kid for his school's newspaper just interviewed me because he had come and was all excited. So it definitely connects with younger people.
Now, there may be an issue of term definition to get straight with the listeners, because we've been mentioning kung fu cinema, we've been mentioning exploitation films, and of course Grindhouse has come up a couple times. I'll throw this out here. The kung fu cinema we've discussed is one segment of the wider umbrella of exploitation film, correct? And Grindhouse
is
something else?
Yeah, I mean, those terms are... Yeah. I mean, exploitation film, I always say, consider like the Kung Fu films exploitation films, right. Which maybe isn't even fair, really. Mm. 36 Chamber of Shaolin I wouldn't say that's an exploitation movie. Mm. I mean, even though I'd probably group it in. And as far as Grindhouse, I mean, that term is so broad, and at this point, it doesn't even seem to make sense. But I mean, it's really just those theaters, right. In the inner city that would just play triple features and run movies all night long. And a lot of them were Kung Fu films. Kung Fu films were a huge hit in the inner cities. But also, Italian horror films and low-budget American horror films and those hillbilly movies and blaxploitation.
It seems like 70s. Like, we're talking about the 70s.
Yeah.
Almost by definition, everything... The best of all this stuff comes from the 70s, right?
Yeah, exactly. And really, when you talk about most of this stuff, what it really was is those were the independent movies of that time period.
Oh, I see.
They
were the Richard Linklater films of their time.
They were. They really were. Just because at that time, Hollywood was making serious films. It's not like now where Hollywood makes popcorn films and the independent movies are the serious. It was reversed.
They're making Taxi Driver. Scorsese was working,
Yeah, exactly.
He's working even more now, but then.
Yeah, all those films. So I think that's interesting. I think sometimes that's a hard thing for people. They think that they're just bad movies. And they come, they're like, oh, that was actually, I hear this all the time, that was actually a good movie. Yeah, I know. I don't show bad movies. They're good movies.
Now, what are your feelings? We brought up Tarantino, and of course he had the film Grindhouse, the tribute to the Grindhouse sensibility, the double feature, the original double feature he made with Robert Rodriguez, not to like a whole lot of fanfare at the time. Maybe it's been more respected since, but more successfully, like a Black Dynamite, like the new blaxploitation movie. How have you felt about those tributes, those new tributes to Grindhouse films that try to seem old in some sense?
Yeah, those films I'm not a fan of. Even the Grindhouse movie I did not like at all. Although normally I'm a big fan of Tarantino's movies, and I think his movies usually pay great tribute to those films and are in the same vein as those films without calling it that. Kill Bill was hugely influenced by Shaw Brothers movies, and it even has the Shaw Scope logo at the beginning of the movie, and it has characters in it from the classic Kung Fu films. And all his films have been influenced by, his early films influenced by like 70s crime movies, some really great, which is a really great subgenre on its own. But yeah, those films that are like more blatantly like this is like the older films, it never seems to work, and it doesn't seem like it's like that at all to me.
I wonder, it might shed light onto what is good about the exploitation films that are from the actual 70s. If we talk about what doesn't work about the new exploitation films, they're trying to get there in so many different ways, but what falls short? Is it just the fact that they didn't come from the 70s? It's never going to be shot through with 70s sensibility, or what is it?
I think that's definitely it. I think it was the time period. It can't be done again, It was a lot of it for the American films. That's where America was. Like, we finally had, the production code went away. So they had the rating system. So now you can have violence and sex in movies. Right. So, of course, lower budget movies are going to really push the envelope on that. But then you also had like the drug culture and the sex culture at the time. I think that was hugely influenced on the movie. And you had the post-Vietnam era. A lot of those movies. I just showed Rolling Thunder last week, which is a revenge film written by Paul Schrader around the same time he wrote Taxi Driver. And that movie could have only come out of that time. It basically was like the American psyche at that time and America's reaction to Vietnam. I think all of that plays into it so much. And so much of it was those movies were made on the streets, Taxi Driver, even though it was a Hollywood film, that's a gritty movie because, shot on 42nd Street and Times Square at that time. That was that time. Like now Times Square isn't like that. It's like Disneyland, Yes. So I think that's what it's all about.
I wonder if you've paid much attention to this. I assume you have a bit, but the way that Portland has come through in cinema lately, I think of, my favorite Portland movie recently was, I guess you're always going to be talking about Gus Van Sant. We talk about Portland movies, but Paranoid Park. I don't know what you've seen that's sort of Portland reflective in film, if anything that's particularly struck you.
Nothing comes to mind recently. I do think I wish that we had more of a film scene here as far as movies being made. I think I've seen some short films that have been made here that I'm really impressed with, and I hope that those directors go on to make some feature-length films. But I haven't seen anything in a long time that's really impressed me. I'm a big fan of Drugstore Cowboy, but that's been a long time.
That's sort of the capturing of the Pearl District before it became what it is. Very expensive is what it is today, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's completely different now, yeah.
Was that an era you were living here in Portland? Was that sort of late 80s?
That was before I was here.
Okay. I do wonder, in the time you've been in Portland, I mean, have you seen a lot of change in the city? This sort of the Pearl districting of other parts of it. I mean, how is it? How does it compare? I'll say this, since it was the cool city that you were distant from in your population 600 town, where you had good times certainly, but Portland always seemed like cool. Is it different now?
It is different. The city's changed a lot. I mean, there's been a lot of progressive growth in the city. Which brings good and bad elements, I guess. But yeah, the Pearl District is a huge example. That was a really run-down area. Now it's really nice, expensive condos. That's all that's down there. And that's happened in a few different areas around town, which, I mean, I guess for the most part it's good, right? It's good for small business. It's good for the neighborhoods. Sometimes, obviously, it seems like you lose a little bit, some of the character of the neighborhood. But yeah, it seems like the city's grown in positive ways, I guess.
And what exactly is this neighborhood called we're in right now, where the Hollywood Theater is? It slipped my mind what I should be referring to this exact neighborhood as.
It's actually the Hollywood District, named after the theater, yeah.
Okay, so you have a whole district named after your theater. That's decent publicity, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the theater's from 1926, so, classic theater.
We talked on our way down to the basement here about Portland being just big enough or just small enough. How do you think about it in that sense? It's not a huge city, but it does feel bigger than it, I would say, is. I mean, you can support a monthly kung fu cinema series. I mean, what's small about that? Do you know what I mean? How do you think about the size and sort of what that affords?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it is a small city, and especially, I think all of the trendy areas or everything that is more popular that people are interested in the city is in a really consolidated space. But I think there's so many benefits. I prefer it. Maybe it's because I came from a small town. But when I go to bigger cities, like I can't stand the traffic, and it takes forever to get anywhere. LA and New York, it's just too much for me. I like Chicago, but so yeah, I just think there's a lot of benefits. We're right by the mountain. You can get out of the city, close to the coast. It's interesting. There
was a second half of a question that I meant to ask, and I forgot, but I asked you about the one film to introduce to the gateway drug to Kung Fu cinema. Right. But, say you're here in Portland, you're programming that as one half of a double bill. What's the other half for people who want to get into Kung Fu cinema, but they've never seen anything, and they see that one? What do you put on the other half of the bill?
For another Kung Fu film?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess when I travel, a lot of times I want to show Five Element Ninjas, which is the early 80s Chang Che film. It's campy, but it's a lot of fun for a crowd. And it's great for a second half of a double bill because it's a fast-moving movie. But I'd be more interested along those lines to maybe show something else. Like I like showing a Kung Fu film and even a different kind of exploitation film.
So you might do a non-Kung Fu film, but still 70s, still exploitation?
Well, I mean, one of my favorite films, whenever people ask me what my favorite movie is, I usually throw out Shogun Assassin, which is a samurai film, 1980. I think that's a really interesting film for people who don't know about Japanese cinema, which so many of those movies never made it over here, especially during that time. And I think people only think of it as like Akira Kurosawa and Ozu and like the well-known directors. So I really like unleashing like that movie on an audience. Is amazing to see the response from it. So I'd maybe pick that, even though it's not even a Kung Fu film.
In Japanese cinema, it's a particular specialty of mine. What does Shogun Assassin get right?
Well, it's I mean, it is definitely an exploitation film because it's actually two different movies that were edited together into one film.
You probably see that more than you'd think.
Yeah. And that one especially because there was a series of films called the Lone Wolf and Cub films, and there were 6 films. And so Shogun Assassin was the first 2 films in that series cut together. And then dubbed. It's actually a dub movie and then with a different soundtrack added to it. And it creates a completely different experience from what the original films were. But it's samurai film, it's fast moving, it's really violent, but there's a lot more to it. Watching it's an emotional movie, and it's crowd pleaser, it's a lot of fun. I love it.
Now, you mentioned off mic beforehand, we're talking a little bit about the sort of inevitable subject these days in film programming, which is the death or the disappearance of 35 millimeter film, celluloid. And you mentioned that these prints, the ones you found in Vancouver, are in good condition because of they were in Vancouver and they were down there below and protected. But audiences like seeing a beaten up print occasionally when it's kung fu.
Yeah, they do, or even other exploitation films. A lot of times I'll apologize to the audience ahead of time. This is the only known print. The color's faded. There's a lot of scratches. Sometimes I have to repair films, put tons of splices in the film.
As listeners might not know, you get a print. It's sometimes full of splices, and you don't know what's going on in there until you thread it up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. And sometimes I'll get a print from. I've bought films from. There's a guy in San Francisco, a film collector, who used to just pull films out of dumpsters behind theaters back in the 70s and 80s, and even I think before that. So he just had, he was more of a hoarder. He was into classic American cinema, but he just has tons of films. So I bought quite a few kung fu films from him that were pulled out of a dumpster. And, the film quality would be fine, but they weren't even on reels, so I have to do so much repair. Sometimes I'm spending hours repairing a film. So, I'll apologize to an audience, but they actually really respond to that. And I think because of getting more used to a digital, flat, kind of boring experience, and then the film, I don't know if it just makes it seem more alive or what, but people are definitely... They enjoy it, even though I always, if it's scratches on screen, and I'm like, oh, God, I wish it wasn't so scratched. And it seems like the audience is enjoying that, or like it's adding to the experience or something.
Even if new films are not distributed on film, it's hard to see celluloid going away as a sort of, I don't want to say antiquarian, but it's kind of a fun thing. I mean, maybe it'll get expensive maybe the projectionists will all die. I don't know how robust in Los Angeles, I've met a lot of the projectionists. It's a small circle, and none of them are spring chickens. Right. I will say that. So do you think we're in the last decade or two of watching celluloid, or is this the kind of thing, you'll always be able to see, like, hey, look, they're playing it on film, 30, 40 years from now. That won't be unusual. It might be occasional. But how do you see that going forward?
I think it's going to become very rare because most theaters are at this point already have thrown away their film projectors and they're digital only. I think you'll only be able to see film in the major cities in the future, and really major.
This is a good point because, I live in Los Angeles. I moved there in large part because of the revival cinema scene. I haven't been to a multiplex in a long time. Are they, you go to the 8-screen theaters playing all new stuff. Is that by definition they're all digital now, or what's going on?
Yeah, almost all of those are digital. The studios have pretty much told everyone that it's not. There's no definite date set, but the end of this year, end of 2012, is pretty much where they've told you need to be digital because film is going away. And 20th Century Fox was the first major studio to flat out say it, and they don't even do film at all anymore. If you want to show a classic film from 20th Century Fox, they do not have 35 millimeter prints at all. And that's going to happen with all the studios. So it'll be film archives and film collectors that, there's plenty of, the UCLA has a huge film archive, and there's plenty across the country, and the Academy has one. So there will be resources out there, but it's going to make it a lot more expensive, and with fewer and fewer venues, it's going to get really rare to see film.
So here at the Hollywood Theater, you've got the standard gauges of projectors set up. You've got digital as well. You have to put a bunch of stuff side by side, and it depends. How does that work? I've never projected anything.
Sure, yeah, we have 35 millimeter and digital and 16 millimeter. So we can do a lot of different formats and a lot of, I don't know if I'd say a lot of independent theaters, but theaters that are more like film societies or, the art museums out there that are pretty much set up that way. You can do digital and film because that's the way it's going to have to be. We couldn't just show film all the time because we show newer films too, which have to be digital.
Now, as a cinephile, in addition to being a film programmer, as a film goer as well as a film programmer, tell me about Portland film-going culture, because it seems like you guys have especially something going on here that Los Angeles would really do well to pay attention to, which is you've integrated food and beer and microbrews and stuff. It's now like an eating experience as well as like it's more of a sensory experience than just watching now. I mean, that's come together in Portland in a way that it hasn't anywhere else, has it?
Yeah, maybe in Austin, I guess, with the Alamo Drafthouse. Right. But yeah, in Portland, I mean, I think it was happening here first. And it's great because that's your night out. It's not, we're going out for food and then the movie and then we get drinks. It's all one thing. So I don't know. It's great for the theater. I mean, in this day and age with so much competition, I mean, you have to have beer to make money.
In Portland especially. I mean, is it the beer culture that has prompted that in Portland? I'm not sure.
That's a big part of it. Yeah, we have so many microbreweries and, everybody's making beer in their basement. So
now this is important to bring up. I guess it'll seem like a sudden shift, but you've been tased. And film was involved in the story. What happened? Why were you tased? And how did Kung Fu film get applicable to this?
Right. Yeah. It was 4 years ago. It was 2008. I was walking home from a night out with friends. We're at a bar close to my house, and I was walking home, and I suddenly had a flashlight come on. It was about a little after midnight. It's completely dark, and I couldn't see who it was, and I just heard a voice say, "Get him." And I heard footsteps coming at me, so I just thought I was being jumped. So I turned and I ran, and I got tased. And I fell on the ground, and I got tased 4 more times. And then I was screaming for help, and I was screaming for someone to call the police, and somebody was on my back, and my hands got zip-tied. So I was screaming, and I was pulled up from the ground, and they turned me around, and it turns out they were the cops. Right. They were the police, but they hadn't identified themselves at all. So they had been in the area looking for some people who had painted graffiti. I had come by, they just thought I was one of the guys or whatever, and all this happened. So, but they tased me 5 times. Which could have killed me.
Yeah, it seems like that's one of those things you're lucky to be alive after having happened. But getting tased, I don't know if people know what that is. It's like a kind of dart thing. Like what is it actually?
Yeah, it's these 2. These barbs on these metal wires that shoot into you, and they both have to hit you to make the complete circuit. And then it's I can't remember how many volts it is. 5,000 or 25,000? I can't remember.
5,000 is bad enough.
Yeah, it felt like being set on fire. And it's a much more serious weapon than I think people consider it right now. Like, I've been interviewed since this whole thing by some people making documentaries about it, and everybody wants it to be actually classified as a deadly weapon instead of a non-lethal weapon like it is now, because so many people have been killed by it.
But once those darts get into you, they can just keep pulling the thing?
Yeah, they can just keep pulling it, and then it's a surge of electricity, and I think it cuts it off, and then they have to actually pull the trigger again. So anyway, all that happened, and, I was really injured. I had to go to the hospital. My face was fractured, and tons of abrasions and injuries to my face, and my wrists. So anyway, I sued, had a lawsuit, sued the city and the main officer involved, and we went to court, and the officer lied in court. He had this whole other story that he made up about it, which kind of fell apart in court. But
he knows he's going down if do anything.
Yeah, exactly. So leading up to the trial, which I thought they would settle, my lawyer thought they would settle, but we actually went to court. And leading up to it, I had my deposition, and while I was in my deposition, there's talking about the incident and talking about me and, everything. And then they start talking about Kung Fu films, which is totally surreal. And so it ends, and I go out with my lawyer, and I'm like, what was that about? And he was like, I knew it. He's like, they are going to try to say, they're going to try to use Kung Fu against you somehow.
Oh, yeah.
So
this is like 20 years ago. He played Mortal Kombat. You know what I mean?
I know. So Yeah, I have. I've never studied martial arts or anything like that. So, a couple days before the trial, my lawyer said that the lawyers and the judge had gotten together, and their side was going to try to say that since I show kung fu films, I must have tried to use kung fu against the cops, which is totally insane. It's insane.
You can't learn kung fu from these movies.
From the movies, you definitely can't. So the judge threw it out. He wouldn't allow it in the trial. But when we went to trial a few days later, and I was on the stand, they still brought it up. The city attorney still asked me about my kung fu collection and about showing kung fu movies, I guess to try to just plant something in the jury's mind.
They're clearly grabbing at straws at that point.
Yeah, totally. So, and then my lawyer, had to respond with, so you never had any martial arts training? And I'm like, no. So, I won the trial, but that aspect of it totally, I became an internet sensation for like 3 days, in this day and age. That just, Huffington Post and everybody picked up on it, and guy tased over kung fu movies, and it's just ridiculous. So strange.
Coming from Los Angeles, where we're kind of obsessed with the relationship between the military and military, might as well be sometimes, the police and the population. I mean, I never thought of Portland as having a notably poor relationship between the people and the law enforcement. Is that this obviously makes you think a certain way about that, but was that already kind of an issue? Like the cops might be going a little too far in Portland?
Yeah, definitely. We actually, for this being this peaceful city, is what we're known for. We have a really aggressive police force. We're really known for it. There's lots of incidents all the time, for taser usage, and people have been killed by the police from excessive force. It's actually a huge problem.
Right. I wonder, in the Northwest, I grew up around Seattle, and like in the Northwest, you always think that there's like a lot of meth crime, and cops have to deal with people who are just berserk. Does any of that come from that here in Portland? Like, what can you pin this on?
I have no idea. I don't know where it comes from, but it's a problem, and it's the divide between the police force and the community. Like it should be more integrated than it is, but they're kept so separate. That it's. I don't know. It's something that needs to be addressed, obviously, from my experience.
Yes. Would you describe, police aside, Portland as otherwise a well-integrated city where the populations can come together? Maybe they can come together over something like a kung fu film, or Los Angeles, we always talk about this with atomization of the population. They're there and they're there, and whether you're talking about races or interests or classes, what do you see Portland as being in that sense?
Yeah, Portland, it's integrated. I guess Portland has a little bit of a weird history because it was a pretty racist city for a long time, I've been told that's why we don't have a bigger Asian population here than we do, is because, it was just so white and whatever for so long. But it seems to be integrated now, and we have a lower crime rate, but... Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's not like L.A. with the definite areas so much.
Right. I live in Koreatown, where it's the collision of Korea and southern Mexico, actually, which delicious food there, I can tell you.
That's great.
But people do. Portlanders, every Portlander I talk to is very happy with the city. They appreciate everything about it. But then they always say, well, it's not that diverse. There's not a lot of diversity here. That's always what they come back to. Yeah. Some really don't like that. Some are just kind of irked by it. But tell me about, you're a contributor to the cultural diversity in any case of this city, and what do you think of as the mission? Like to if the population isn't that diverse now, whatever, but is it like we can make the culture as diverse as possible in Portland, as many experiences as possible, be it through exploitation or whatever? Is that something you think about as a programmer?
Definitely. It definitely is. I think for me, programming, I really try to put together events and bring in movies that are different from what's already happening here in Portland. I think so many people really try to cater to what's popular, and we all know from Portlandia, like what's going on in the city, which sometimes it feels like a circus. So it drives me insane.
But you can confirm that it's not as much of a satire as some might think.
It's not. Well, is it a satire?
To my mind?
Yeah.
Well, I only come here once a year, so I mean, you live in Portland. But everybody I've talked to almost has brought up Portlandia, and I said to myself, don't bring up Portlandia. But everybody else does.
Yeah.
And they say something like, well, we all have a story that could be, our life story. There's chapters that could be just Portlandia sketches, unadulterated. Yeah. And they say it's a satire, but not that much of one. I mean, and it reflects on the culture how to you here.
Portlandia? Yeah. Well, it's something that does bother me, and it may play into the lack of diversity. I think maybe somehow, a lot of people who maybe have had a life of too much privilege, where your life becomes like frivolous. I don't know, you can ride around on a unicycle, or I saw
one of those guys going by, utility kilts and whatnot.
You really see that. So I don't know. I mean, getting back to it though, I just try to bring something else to the culture of Portland. That's something that isn't just going to be more of that or cater to that young hip audience. Know,
there's a sense in which you can maybe broaden the Portland horizons with what you do.
Yeah, I hope so. I'd try to do that. I think. Yeah.
Now, how easy or hard is it to do that? How much resistance or acceptance do you find doing? How quickly and how far can you push out the film limits?
I try to find that out all the time. I try to just keep pushing it. I really try to spend the time to, find really obscure movies and great films that haven't been screened, or even newer films as well. I mean, since I won my lawsuit, it also puts me in a unique position where I can find, pay for a lot of films. In the past I couldn't, so that's interesting.
Any big surprises recently with what you've been able to really sell, quote unquote, to the Portland audience?
Recently,
or whenever, it doesn't have to be recent.
I just feel like it's ongoing. Like, specific example, it just seems like the monthly Kung Fu Theater series being so popular in the films I've been able to show. I think it's just exciting. I can't think of anything specific. I should.
So if someone comes to Portland, they want to get into the film culture, they want to see some Kung Fu movies, what should they know?
They should know to just come to the Hollywood Theater. Come here and just check out what we're doing all the time. We're always doing interesting repertory films and newer films and one-off events, and we really try to experiment with, programming and kind of just the idea of what a movie theater is, more than what it's been in the past, And other theaters like the Cine Family in LA does an amazing job with that, I think, and the Alamo Drafthouse in Austin. And we try to do it here, of just like, if independent theaters are going to survive in the future, I assume in the future the megaplexes are going to crumble. That's going to happen.
It's about time.
Yeah, it is. I know. Because
I haven't gotten my money in a while. I don't know how they're surviving.
Me either. Yeah, the only reason they're around right now is because they're fighting on demand. They won't release movies. They won't play films that are released at the same day and date on demand. They just won't do it. Eventually, some studio is going to fight them on that and just say, we're going to do it. Screw you. And when that happens, that's when they'll crumble. So the independent theaters, I think it's important for us to just figure out what can you do, what else can you do? Whether it's older films or really unique independent stuff, or, we experiment with all types of unique events that you can only get in a theater. You can't do at home. So I think that's really interesting to see, like, the movie theater of the future.
I've been speaking in the basement of the Hollywood Theater, perhaps the movie theater of the future, in Portland, Oregon, in the Hollywood District, with Dan Halsted. He programs the films here. He is the founder of the Grindhouse Festival in Portland. He's the founder of the 35mm Shaolin Archive. He's been called the Indiana Jones of film archiving by the Willamette Week. He is a cornerstone of Portland film culture, especially exploitation culture of the 70s. Dan, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the program at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.